After reading The Third Source by Glenn C. Laurie, I think I'm pronouncing that right, her main argument was the influence of slave society is taken from the past civil war that the Southern slaves be free slaves. What I mean by that is she goes on to explaining the past of history that has happened with the free black slaves, that after the revolution and the Civil War, most Southern slave owners had to let their slaves free since there was a thing that was passed. She goes on and on about the history of black slaves and goes further into detail, and then she goes more into modernization, and she kind of categorizes her opinions on each statement. I wrote down a couple notes so that it could help me remember. She thinks there's still a modern race problem. They suffer a pariah status. So she thinks that the African American community is still not seen as equal. And what she means by that is legal equality for blacks after a century of second-class citizenship has for the most part failed to win a national commitment toward eradicating the effects of this historical inheritance. That they're also categorized as less, and there is still a racial problem. Unfortunately, she believes that. And the current campaign against preferences goes too far by turning what before proposition had been a reform movement into an abolitionist crusade. So she is just declaring that there is definitely some racial differences and a lot of categorization between the African American community. She believes there's still a racial problem, and especially in these past 3 years, there has been a lot of movements for the African American community, positive in most eyes and negative in the right side. What I personally think is that the African American community needs to have a voice, and I feel like that has been recently happening in our new generation. I feel like they're always classified as less for some reason, and they're always picked whenever they are picked for certain categories, but they're not being mesmerized, or they're not being highlighted for their highlights, for their accomplishments, and like declaring them and them having more of a spotlight on whenever it's really deserved. So that was mostly what her argument was about. How might the legacy of slavery that Laurie discusses relate to racial issues that we're seeing in American society today? So obviously I related the slavery to issues that we're seeing today. It's obviously racial issues with the African American society. There is definitely some inequality, and like I was saying, there is picks and pokes of when they want to highlight the African American community positively. In the past generation, there hasn't been that much of a highlight for the community, so she was just having argumentations about how African Americans are picked on, almost as if like they're the outsiders, when really we should all be as one, as a community and unified. And she's saying how all these things in history has freed the African Americans and slaves, but she's really questioning if has everything been freed? Has the African American people really gotten their freedom like everybody else, their equality? That's basically all that she summarized in all the 7 pages. I did like how she mentioned a couple of quotations from two books that she had mentioned. But overall, I do agree with her in a majority of her aspects she was talking about. I feel like she does have great points about the African American community in today's generation and society. And also, I like how she includes the background history of African Americans, of like where it originated, mostly like after the Civil War and like where we are now. And yeah, thank you for watching.